It was in the warmth of late summer, when the air was thick with the scent of ripened grapes and the cicadas droned on in the afternoons, that I found myself standing at the edge of the life I thought I'd known. They say that sometimes the quietest places can be the ones that hold the most secrets, and our vineyard was no exception. It was meant to be a retreat, a place to come back to year after year, a sanctuary for Victor and me, woven with memories of family gatherings, laughter and harvests that marked the passage of time. But Reed's arrival that summer was like a stone dropped into still water. I had always known of him, Victor's estranged son from his first marriage, a man with a quiet intensity that seemed to carry his past with him like a shadow. When he stepped onto the vineyard, his face framed by the dappled light filtering through the vines, I felt something shift, as if the air itself had thickened. At first, it was nothing more than polite conversation, late-night exchanges that drifted from one topic to another. He had a way of looking at me, an attentiveness that made me feel seen in ways I hadn't felt in years. And though I told myself it was just harmless talk, I knew deep down that something in me was stirring, something I couldn't ignore. Victor, of course, had his suspicions. He was a man who rarely missed details, and I could feel his gaze on me, the quiet way he watched our interactions, as if he were waiting for a crack in the foundation. He never spoke of it directly, but his questions lingered, subtle and sharp, a reminder that even in a place as isolated as our vineyard, secrets could be dangerous things. This is not a love story, nor is it a simple tale of betrayal. It's a story about choices, about moments that seem small, until you look back and realize they were the ones that changed everything. And as I stand here now, the echoes of that summer still lingering in the empty rooms of my mind, I wonder if there was anything I could have done differently, or if I was simply swept along by a force greater than myself. But I suppose that's the way secrets are. They grow in the dark, in the spaces between what's said and what's left unsaid. And once they've taken root, there's no going back. The vineyard had always been Victor's pride and joy, a sprawling estate tucked between the hills, with rows of vines stretching as far as the eye could see. The land was a mixture of cultivated vines and untamed edges, where oaks grew wild and tangled thickets lined the paths. Every year, the vineyard came alive at harvest time, a time when family and friends gathered to celebrate the season's bounty. I had grown accustomed to these gatherings, the way they blended tradition and celebration, but this year it felt different. Victor, at 75, had become increasingly reliant on me to manage the smaller tasks around the estate. He liked to oversee everything, from the vineyards to the wine production, and he did it all with the precision of a man who had never known failure. He was charming in his own way, persuasive, and even in retirement he maintained a certain control over the day-to-day running of the estate, a control he rarely relinquished. This year, however, he'd invited Reed. I had only heard bits and pieces of Reed's story over the years. A son from Victor's first marriage, a marriage that had broken up long before I ever came into his life. Victor's bitterness towards his son had always been thinly veiled, a quiet resentment that coloured the few times he'd mentioned him. To hear him tell it, Reed was a disappointment, someone who'd chosen a path far removed from Victor's vision of a responsible, successful life. But when Reed arrived, he was nothing like the picture Victor had painted. He was tall, with an easy grace, his movements quiet, as if accustomed to being alone, comfortable in solitude. His clothes were simple, a worn shirt, jeans, boots that looked like they'd seen miles of road. There was a stillness about him, an intensity that suggested a life lived outside the confines of comfort and security. The first time he looked at me, his gaze lingered just a fraction too long, his expression thoughtful, curious, as if trying to place me in the landscape of his father's world. It was a look that made me feel exposed, seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I could feel the pull of his presence, the way he seemed both familiar and strange, a reminder of a time in my life that felt far away and yet somehow close. Over the next few days, Reed's presence became part of the vineyard's daily rhythm. He would wander the rows of vines, sometimes disappearing for hours, only to reappear in the late afternoon, his face shaded with a thoughtful, distant look. He had a way of drifting through the house, moving quietly, his presence a constant but unobtrusive reminder that he was watching, observing. Victor seemed both pleased and wary of his son's attention to the vineyard. He watched Reed from a distance, his gaze sharp, appraising, as if he were assessing a rival rather than his own son. Their conversations were short, stilted exchanges that held an underlying tension. I could sense the gulf between them, a space filled with unspoken resentments and grievances that neither seemed willing to address. "So, you've taken an interest in the vineyard," Victor remarked one evening as Reed joined us on the terrace where we often sat to enjoy the evening air. Reed shrugged, his eyes sweeping over the rows of vines. "It's peaceful here," he replied, his tone non-committal. "I can see why you like it." Victor's expression softened for a moment before it hardened again, a flicker of something close to pride quickly masked by his usual caution. I watched them in silence, sensing the tension that simmered beneath their words, the unspoken history that hung in the air between them. And as I watched them, I felt a strange mixture of empathy and curiosity, a desire to understand the rift between them, to uncover the layers that had brought them to this quiet standoff. As the days went by, I found myself drawn to Reed, intrigued by his quietness, his introspective nature that contrasted so sharply with Victor's controlled intensity. He was a man of few words, but there was a warmth in him, a gentleness that was unexpected given the harsh picture Victor had painted. When he spoke, it was with a thoughtfulness that caught me off guard, a quiet intelligence that seemed to suggest he saw more than he let on. One afternoon, while Victor was in town handling some business, I found Reed in the library, absorbed in a book. I paused in the doorway, hesitant to disturb him, but he looked up and smiled, a soft, unassuming expression that made me feel unexpectedly shy. "Didn't mean to intrude," I said, stepping into the room. He shrugged, setting the book aside. "You're not intruding, I was just passing the time." There was a comfortable silence between us, the kind that felt natural, unforced. I sat down across from him, my gaze drifting to the shelves lined with books, most of them untouched relics of a family history that felt distant, remote. I glanced at him, sensing his curiosity, his quiet attention that seemed to envelop me, making me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Do you come here often?" he asked, his tone casual, though I sensed a genuine interest behind the question. I nodded, feeling a faint smile tug at my lips. "I suppose it's become my refuge, this house. It can feel very large, very empty." He nodded, his gaze softening, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of connection that was both exhilarating and unnerving. In that moment, I realized that he understood, that he saw the quiet loneliness that lingered beneath the surface of my life, the restlessness that I had tried to ignore. We spent the rest of the afternoon in quiet conversation, our words weaving a fragile connection that felt both thrilling and dangerous, a subtle intimacy that lingered even after he left the room. Victor, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the undercurrents that had begun to stir. He was preoccupied with the vineyard, the harvest, the endless details that demanded his attention. He moved through his days with a sense of purpose, a single-minded focus that left little room for anything beyond the immediate tasks at hand. The vineyard was everything to him, a legacy he had built from the ground up, a testament to his vision and determination. But as he busied himself with the logistics of the harvest, I found myself slipping further into my connection with Reed, drawn to him in ways I couldn't quite understand or resist. There was something about him, a quiet confidence, a sense of self-assurance that made me feel both vulnerable and alive, as if he were peeling back the layers I had so carefully constructed. One evening, as we walked through the vineyard at dusk, Reed turned to me, his gaze pensive. "Do you ever feel trapped here?" he asked, his voice soft, his words tinged with a quiet understanding. I looked at him, surprised by the question, by the way it seemed to echo my own thoughts, my own sense of imprisonment that I had never dared to voice. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, "but it's complicated." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and for a moment we just stood there, the silence between us filled with unspoken words, a connection that felt both fragile and powerful, as if we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't yet name. From that moment on, our interactions took on a new intensity, a quiet charge that lingered in every glance, every casual touch. We were careful, cautious, our conversations laced with a subtle tension that hinted at something more, something neither of us dared to acknowledge. But there was no denying the attraction between us, the way he looked at me with a quiet curiosity, a warmth that made me feel alive, seen, wanted. I knew it was dangerous, that I was walking down a path that could only lead to ruin, but I couldn't pull myself away. His presence was intoxicating, a reminder of the life I had once dreamed of, a life of passion, spontaneity, and connection. And as we moved through the days, our unspoken bond growing stronger, I realized that I was on the edge of something irreversible, a choice that would change everything. It started gradually, like an ember catching flame. At first, it was the smallest gestures. Reed brushing past me in the hall, the briefest touch of his hand against mine, each moment lingering a bit longer than it should have. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it, that I was simply responding to the loneliness that had been my companion for so many years. But with each passing day, I felt myself drawn further into his presence, pulled into an orbit that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Victor remained largely unaware, his days filled with the demands of the vineyard and the preparations for harvest. I would watch him from a distance, his figure silhouetted against the rows of vines, his movements brisk, purposeful, as if chasing something only he could see. He had always been a man who needed a mission, a goal, and the vineyard had become his world, a place where he could channel all his energy, all his ambition. But while Victor was preoccupied with his vision, I found myself slipping further into Reed's world, a world that felt infinitely more real, more alive. We shared quiet moments in the library, conversations that stretched into the late hours of the night, our words weaving a fragile bond that grew stronger with each exchange. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the vineyard, Reed found me alone on the terrace, looking out over the fields. He came to stand beside me, his presence a steady warmth that seemed to wrap around me, grounding me in the moment. "It's beautiful out here," he murmured, his voice soft, his gaze focused on the distant hills. I nodded, feeling my pulse quicken, the quiet intensity of his presence making it hard to think, hard to breathe. "It is," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. And as I turned to look at him, our eyes met, a silent understanding passing between us. Without a word, he reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both comforting and dangerous. We stood there for a moment, the silence heavy with unspoken words, before he pulled me closer, his touch soft, tentative, as if waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Our first encounter was like a breath of fresh air, a release from the years of quiet resignation that had defined my life with Victor. It was something I hadn't expected, hadn't sought, but now that it was real, I couldn't bring myself to let it go. Reed had awakened something in me, a sense of vitality, of passion, that I had thought long buried. But with that passion came guilt, a nagging sense of betrayal that lingered at the edges of my mind, reminding me of the promises I had made, the life I had chosen. Every time I was with Reed, I felt the thrill of secrecy, the rush of desire, but it was always followed by a hollow ache, a reminder that I was treading on dangerous ground. We became masters of discretion, finding ways to meet without attracting attention, slipping away in the quiet hours of the morning or under the cover of night. There was a thrill in the secrecy, in the knowledge that we were walking a fine line, that we could be discovered at any moment. But that thrill was tempered by the fear, the constant awareness that one misstep, one wrong move could unravel everything. As the days passed, the weight of our secret began to take its toll. I found myself lying awake at night, listening to Victor's steady breathing beside me, feeling the pressure of guilt settle over me like a shroud. I tried to tell myself that what I was doing was harmless, that it was just a fleeting escape from the life I had built. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was no longer just hiding an affair. I was hiding a part of myself, a part I wasn't sure I could ever bring back into the light. One afternoon, as I sat alone in the garden, Reed found me, his presence a quiet reassurance that I clung to in the silence. He sat beside me, his gaze pensive, his expression soft as he reached for my hand. His touch a steady comfort that seemed to ground me, to hold me in place. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with a tenderness that took me by surprise. I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of my emotions, the conflicting desires that had brought me to this point. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel trapped, like I'm caught between two lives, two worlds." He nodded, his expression somber, and for a moment we simply sat there, the silence between us filled with unspoken words, a connection that felt both comforting and bittersweet. I wanted to tell him everything, to unburden myself, but the words wouldn't come, caught somewhere between fear and desire, between loyalty and longing. As the weeks went by, our encounters grew bolder, our moments together filled with an urgency that left me breathless, exhilarated. We would steal kisses in the quiet corners of the vineyard, our touches lingering just a moment too long, each encounter a reminder of the passion that had taken root between us. But with each passing day, the weight of our secret grew heavier. Victor's gaze began to linger, his questions more pointed, his presence a constant reminder that we were walking a dangerous line. He would watch me, his expression thoughtful, as though he were piecing together a puzzle, searching for cracks in the foundation. One evening, as we sat together at dinner, he looked at me, his gaze sharp, his voice calm, as he asked, "Isadora, you seem different lately, distracted." The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I felt my heart stop, my mind racing as I searched for an answer, a way to deflect his suspicion. I forced a smile, keeping my voice steady as I replied, "It's just the season, Victor. The vineyard, the harvest, it's a lot to manage." He nodded, his expression unreadable, but I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken questions lingering in the air, a reminder that our secret was not as hidden as I had thought. One evening, as Reed and I walked along the edge of the vineyard, he turned to me, his gaze pensive, a hint of vulnerability in his expression. "We don't have to keep hiding," he murmured, his voice soft but steady. "We could leave, Isadora, start afresh somewhere else." The suggestion sent a thrill through me, a tantalizing glimpse of freedom, of a life free of secrets and lies. But even as I allowed myself to imagine it, to imagine a life with him beyond the vineyard, I knew it was impossible. I was tied to this life, to the choices I had made, and the thought of leaving it all behind felt as frightening as it was exhilarating. "I can't," I whispered, my voice shaking with the weight of the truth. "I'm not brave enough." He nodded, a faint sadness in his eyes, but he didn't press me, didn't try to change my mind. Instead, he pulled me into his arms and held me close, his touch a quiet reassurance that for now we had this moment, this fleeting escape from the world that waited just beyond the vines. The days that followed our conversation about leaving were a blur of secrecy and tension. Reed had suggested a future that felt both thrilling and impossible, and his words lingered in my mind, a tantalizing promise of freedom that I could never fully allow myself to believe. But as much as I wanted to escape to leave behind the weight of my choices, I knew I was bound to this life to Victor by the threads of loyalty and the life we had built together. Victor, meanwhile, was growing more perceptive, his gaze sharper, his questions more pointed. He had always been an observant man, one who rarely missed details, and I could sense that he was piecing something together, that he was watching me with a careful, calculating eye. His presence was like a shadow, a constant reminder that our secret was hanging by a thread, ready to unravel at any moment. One evening, as we were preparing for a gathering at the vineyard, Victor stopped me in the kitchen. His gaze steady, his voice calm, but with an edge that set me on alert. "Isadora, you've been distant lately," he said, his tone measured as though he were trying to coax a confession from me. "Is everything all right?" I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice light, casual. Of course, Victor, I've just been preoccupied with the vineyard, the preparations, there's a lot to manage." He nodded, though I could see the skepticism in his eyes, a flicker of doubt that made my heart race. I knew he didn't fully believe me, that he was watching me closely, waiting for the slightest crack, the smallest sign that would confirm his suspicions. And as I looked at him, feeling the weight of his gaze, I realized that our secret was no longer just a risk. It was a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. The following afternoon, as I was organizing the library, I came across a folder tucked between the shelves. I almost ignored it, thinking it was another one of Victor's old property documents or invoices. But something about the way it was hidden just slightly out of sight caught my attention. I opened it, feeling a chill settle over me. As I read, the contents inside were a series of letters, financial statements, and legal documents detailing a series of debts and payments made to various creditors. Each document bore Reed's name, along with mentions of past disputes and demands for repayment. There was even a note from a debt collector, the language firm demanding immediate payment on an outstanding balance. My heart sank as I absorbed the implications, the questions that began to surface, each one sharper, more alarming than the last. Had Reed come to the vineyard because of these? Debs, was he using me, manipulating our connection to escape his past? I felt a sense of betrayal, an ache that went deeper than I'd expected. And I realized that I had been blind, caught up in a fantasy, in a vision of Reed that I had constructed for my own loneliness and desires. That evening, when I saw Reed in the garden, I couldn't hold back the questions that had been swirling in my mind. "Why didn't you tell me, Reed?" I whispered, my voice tight, my heart pounding with the weight of my suspicions about the deaths, the trouble. He looked at me, his expression caught between guilt and defensiveness, as though he had been dreading this moment. "I didn't want you to know," he replied, his voice low, resigned. "I wanted to leave all of that behind, to start over." I felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss, as though the illusion I had clung to was slipping away, revealing a truth I wasn't ready to face. I wanted to believe him, to trust that what we shared was real, but the doubts lingered, casting shadows over our connection, a reminder that our love had been built on secrets, on lies that could no longer be ignored. In the days that followed, Victor's suspicion grew sharper, his questions more pointed. I could feel his gaze on me whenever we were together, his eyes narrowing as he observed my every move, his silence filled with an intensity that left me on edge. He was a man who rarely confronted issues directly, preferring instead to watch, to analyze, to let others reveal their secrets through their own actions. One evening, as we hosted a gathering in the vineyard, Victor caught me in a quiet moment, his gaze sharp, his tone accusatory. "Isadora, I can't help feeling that something is wrong between us," he said, his voice low, his words laced with a tension that made my pulse quicken. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I looked at him, my heart pounding, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, choking me. I wanted to deny it, to reassure him, but the words wouldn't come, caught somewhere between my guilt and my loyalty to Reed. "I'm just tired, Victor," I replied, my voice shaking, the lie heavy on my tongue. "It's been a long season and there's so much to do." He nodded, though his expression remained skeptical, his gaze lingering on me as if searching for the truth, a confirmation of the suspicion that had taken root in his mind. Victor's suspicion cast a shadow over everything, a constant reminder of the risk we were taking, the danger that lurked beneath our carefully constructed facade. I could feel my nerves fraying, my emotions stretched thin as I navigated the tension between my love for Reed and the life I had built with Victor, a life that felt increasingly fragile, as if it could crumble at any moment. One afternoon, as I was attending to some tasks in the vineyard, Silas, the vineyard manager and an old friend of Victor's, approached me, his expression pensive, his gaze lingering just a little too long. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Grant?" he asked, his tone polite but with an undertone of concern. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course, Silas. Why wouldn't it be?" He nodded, though his expression remained unconvinced, a flicker of doubt in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew that Silas had known Victor for years, that he was sharp, observant, the kind of man who rarely missed a detail. And as he walked away, I felt a pang of fear, a sense of dread gnawing at me, a reminder that our secret was no longer ours to keep. The weight of our secret, the guilt and the fear finally became too much to bear. One evening, as I met Reed by the lake, the sunset casting a warm glow over the water, I confronted him, my voice filled with a desperation I could no longer contain. "Reed, I don't know if I can go on doing this," I whispered, my voice trembling as I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of my emotions. This secret, this lie, it's eating me up." He looked at me, his expression softening, a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I never meant to hurt you, Isadora," he murmured, reaching for my hand, his touch a steady comfort in the darkness. I needed you. I still do." His words sent a pang of sadness through me, a reminder of the love we had shared, the passion that had bound us together in a way that felt both beautiful and destructive. I wanted to hold on to him, to believe that we could make this work, but the doubts remained, the questions that had haunted me since I had uncovered his secrets. And as we stood there, the silence heavy with unspoken words, I realized that we were at a crossroads, that the choices we had made had led us to a place from which there was no turning back. The evening Victor confronted me, the vineyard was shrouded in a heavy silence, as if the land itself felt the weight of what was to come. The sun had slipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of indigo and deep violet, the colors darkening with each passing moment. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, trying to calm the restless energy that had filled me, when I heard Victor's footsteps approaching, steady and deliberate. "Isadora," he called, his voice firm, a tone he rarely used unless he was addressing something serious. I dried my hands and braced myself as I turned to face him. He stood in the doorway, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my heart pound. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I nodded, swallowing hard, feeling the weight of our secrets press down on me, suffocating me. I had known this moment would come, that our carefully constructed lies would eventually unravel. But now that it was here, I felt a terror I hadn't expected. A fear not just of discovery, but of losing everything I'd ever known. Victor led me into the living room and motioned for me to sit down. He remained standing, his gaze never wavering, his expression a mask of calm that was somehow more unsettling than any outburst could have been. "Is there something you wish to tell me, Isadora?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, but with an edge that sent shivers down my spine. I opened my mouth, searching for words, for some way to explain, to soften the truth. but the silence stretched between us, heavy and unforgiving. "I know about you and Reed," he said finally, his words like a blow, each one hitting me with a force that left me breathless. "I've known for some time. I was just waiting for you to have the decency to tell me yourself. And this is how you repay me." His words hit like a physical blow, the weight of my guilt settling over me like a shroud. I wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but I knew it was too late, that nothing I could say would undo the damage I had done. I never meant for it to happen. I whispered, my voice trembling. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. But even as I spoke, the words felt hollow, empty, a feeble attempt to rationalize something that had shattered our lives beyond repair. Victor's gaze remained steady, his expression unreadable, and I could feel the depth of his anger, the betrayal that had taken root in his heart, a wound that would never fully heal. "I don't care about your excuses, Isadora," he said finally, his voice cold. "I want him gone, and after that I'm not sure I want you here either." Later that night I found Reed by the edge of the lake, his figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. He turned when he saw me approaching, his expression softening, though I could see the tension in his posture, the weariness in his gaze. "He knows Reed," I said, my voice barely a whisper, the words hanging in the air between us, a final, irrevocable truth. He nodded a resigned look. Crossing his face, I figured it was only a matter of time. There was a silence between us, heavy and thick. Each of us caught in our own thoughts, our own regrets. I looked at him, feeling a mixture of sadness and frustration, a sense of loss for the life we could have had, for the love that had been tainted by lies and secrets. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. The weight of the question settling over me, filling me with a dread that was almost palpable. He looked away, his gaze distant, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know," he replied, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. "I never wanted to hurt you, Isadora. I just didn't know how to walk away." His words hit me with a mixture of sorrow and anger, a reminder of the choices we had made, the decisions that had led us to this moment. I wanted to forgive him, to hold on to the love we had shared. But the doubts lingered. The questions that had haunted me since I had discovered his secrets. "You should go," I whispered finally, the words, catching in my throat, each one a painful reminder of the life we had lost. "There's nothing left for us here." He nodded, a flicker of sadness in his eyes, and for a moment I thought he might argue, might try to convince me to leave with him, but he simply turned and walked away. His footsteps fading into the night, leaving me alone in the silence, with nothing but the memories of what once was the days that followed were filled with an emptiness I had never known, a hollow ache that settled in my chest, a reminder of the life I had shattered, the love I had lost Victor. And I existed in a state of silent animosity, moving through the house like strangers, each of us caught in our own grief, our own resentment. He rarely spoke to me, his gaze distant, his expression unreadable. It was as though he had erased me from his life, as though the years we had spent together were nothing more than a memory, a shadow that he was determined to forget. One evening, as we sat across from each other at dinner, Victor looked at me, his gaze filled with a cold determination that sent a chill down my spine. "I've spoken with my lawyer," he said, his voice calm, though his words were laced with a quiet fury. "I want you out of this house by the end of the month." The words hit me like a physical blow, the finality of his decisions settling over me, filling me with a sense of loss that was almost unbearable. I wanted to argue, to plead with him, but I knew it was pointless, that there was no forgiveness left in him, no way to repair the damage that had been done. And as I looked at him, feeling the weight of his anger, his betrayal, I realized that I was truly alone, that the life I had known was gone, lost to the choices I had made, to the secrets that had torn us apart. The morning I left the vineyard was quiet, the air still, the silence heavy with a sense of finality. I packed my belongings, the frag segments of a life that felt distant, foreign, as though it had belonged to someone else. Victor didn't come to see me off. He remained inside a silent reminder of the love that had once been ours, now shattered beyond repair as I drove away. The vineyard receding in the distance, I felt a strange sense of relief, a lightness that I hadn't expected. I had lost everything. My love, my home, the life I had built with Victor. But in that loss there was a quiet freedom, a release from the secrets that had haunted me, the lies that had torn my life apart. And as I looked back one last time, the vineyard fading from view, I felt a bittersweet sense of closure, a quiet acceptance of the choices I had made. The life I had left behind, the weeks that followed my departure from the vineyard, were filled with a strange, quiet emptiness. The world felt both familiar and for as though I were drifting between two lives, the one I had left behind and the one I was slowly learning to navigate alone. At first, each day was a reminder of what I had lost, a series of moments filled with regret, with the echoes of choices I could never take back. I moved to a small town by the coast, renting a modest cottage nestled at the edge of a windswept cliff. The ocean stretching endlessly before me, it was a place far removed from the vineyard, from the life I had known with Victor. And in its quiet simplicity, I found a sense of solace, a chance to rebuild. In the shadow of everything I had left behind, sometimes on stormy nights, I would walk along the cliffs, the wind whipping around me, the waves crashing against the rocks below. Each one a reminder of the tumultuous path I had travelled. I would think back to those days with Reed, the moments we had stolen, the passion that had burned so brightly before it turned to ashes. And though there was a sadness in those memories, a deep ache for what might have been, there was also a quiet acceptance, a recognition that I had loved and lost, and that in some ways that love had set me free. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself reflecting on the choices I had made, on the life I had built with Victor, and the secrets that had ultimately torn us apart. I had loved him once in a way that was steady and unwavering, a love that had felt as solid as the land we had tended together. But over time, that love had grown quiet, settling into a rhythm that left little room for passion, for the kind of connection I'd once dreamed of. And then Reed had arrived, bringing with him a sense of excitement, a reminder of a life I had thought long buried, yet had awakened something in me, a desire for freedom, for adventure, for a connection that felt real, alive. I had given in to that desire, knowing full well the risk, the price I would ultimately pay. And though I had lost everything, I couldn't bring myself to regret it entirely. There was a strange kind of strength in accepting my choices, in facing the consequences, and moving forward. I had betrayed. Victor shattered the life we had built together, and yet in the ashes of what once was, I had found a resilience. I hadn't known I possessed a quiet resolve to forge a new path, to reclaim a sense of self that had been lost in the shadows of my past. In time, the ache of loss began to fade, replaced by a gentle peace, a sense of quiet that settled over me like a balm. I found a rhythm in the solitude, a sense of purpose in the small, simple tasks of everyday life. Had begun painting again, capturing the beauty of the coastline, the ever-changing colours of the ocean, the way the light danced across the waves. Each brushstroke was a release, a way of letting go, of unburdening myself from the weight of the past. People in town would sometimes ask me about my life, about where I had come from, but I kept my answers vague, offering only fragments of a story that had once defined me. I wasn't the same woman who had arrived at the vineyard all those years ago, the wife who had stood beside Victor, content in the role she had chosen. I was something else now, someone forged in the fire of love and loss, someone who had faced the depths of her own soul and emerged, changed, scarred but whole. And as I moved through each day, as the memories faded and the pain softened, I found a sense of gratitude for the life I had lived, for the love I had known. Even if it had been fleeting, I had loved deeply, fiercely, and though it had cost me everything, it had also set me free, allowing me to step into a life that was truly my own. Now, as I stand here looking out over the ocean, the waves rolling in a steady rhythm, I feel a quiet resolve, a peace that comes from accepting the choices that have led me here. I am no longer haunted by the ghosts of my past, by the regrets and what-ifs that once filled my mind. I have found a freedom in the solitude, a strength in the quiet that surrounds me, and for the first time in years, I feel whole, complete, in a way that I never thought possible. I may never know if Reed found the life he was searching for, if he ever discovered the peace he had been seeking in our time together, and I may never see Victor again, may never find the forgiveness I once craved. But I know now that I don't need it, that I am enough on my own, that the life I have built in the wake of everything I have lost is one that belongs to me and me alone. And as the sun sets over the water, casting the world in hues of gold and crimson, I find myself smiling, a quiet, bittersweet smile, as I turn away from the past and face the future, ready to embrace whatever lies ahead